Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone. And now, here is your host, the lovely, delightful, insightful, and all-around great gal, Ms. Barbara DeLong.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Nightlight. I am really excited tonight to have an amazing man on with me, and all of you know that those of you that listen on a frequent basis, that one of my loves and fascinations are the giants, and how they did exist, and they were for real, and history seems to have not brought them into the fore, and certainly they aren't mentioned in our history books. I taught school for 25 years and never saw a mention of one giant. I have Jason Jarrell on with me tonight. He's a published author and lecturer who's published articles with Ancient Origins, Alternative Perspectives magazine, Road to Ruins, and Ancient America magazine. He's spoken publicly on such topics as the prehistoric cultures of America and the ancient North America giants. He's also appeared on the Ancient Alien television program, and his new book, which I have just finished reading and was phenomenal, is co-written with his wife Sarah, and though we don't have her on the line with us, she did a great deal of the work on the book as well and took a lot of the photographs. The book is called Ages of the Giants, A Cultural History of the Tall Ones in Prehistoric America, which uses actual archaeological sources and academic data to trace the history of a remarkable people with a unique physicality over the span of over 4,000 years. You heard me, 4,000 years. The book is amazing. It is. We've all seen all of the newspaper articles from the 1800s. They're all over the place, and they have taken these articles and they have authenticated them. They have documented them. They have really done an amazing amount of phenomenal research to put a bulk of work together that is, it's history for sure, and it's a history that most of us aren't even aware of. So let me, before I get too far into this, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for reading the book and for your kind words.
Oh, listen, I insist on reading the books of anybody that I talk to on this show. I mean, the amount of work you put into this work is phenomenal, and to not honor that by actually reading it, to me, it just is unheard of. I couldn't possibly do it. This book is a topic that I have been fascinated with for years, and I think I got into it because my late husband, Patrick Cook, of course, spoke of the 36 tribes of giants that were in the Bible, and you have 36 tribes. They have to have gone somewhere or been something or whatever. And from that to the Britten Wiener Cave in Bavaria, I think it is, where in 1576 or something, the townspeople went into the cave and found the bones of giants, to the fact that they have been discovered all over this country, and there's really not a mention of them in any of the history books, which is horrifying. But then when you take the time to read through a book like yours, you realize that we haven't even documented the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples, or whatever you want to call them. We really have no real knowledge of them either in any of our history books, and it's such a shame.
You are absolutely correct. And just to put this in perspective, as many accounts of the tall ones, as we refer to them, as we did include in the book, and that we have been able to verify with some mainstream archaeological documentation, this book is only discussing the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley, and it's only covering about 4,000 years. When you consider that human history on this continent goes back tens of thousands of years, and we didn't even touch, the things that are in the South and on the West Coast, that really puts the magnitude of this phenomenon in perspective.
Well, it makes me really sad that those who are reporting our history are not reporting it. And when you speak of antiquity, you think of Egypt, Rome, Greece, those guys. But you don't even they never go into anything here on the North American continent. It's almost like it was left absolutely empty for tens of thousands of years, and then the Pilgrims came, and there were a few groups of wandering Indians that happened to be here, but there weren't that many of them. And that's not the case.
No, it's the educational system in the United States has kind of been hijacked, and anything that doesn't just produce another slave on an assembly line is kind of thrown to the side. I know that while researching this book, I personally was blown away at the elaborate cosmology that is reflected in the artifacts and the burial mounds and earthworks of the Edina and Hopewell mound builders in the Ohio Valley. This is a culture that deserves to be considered equal with the more famous examples from the old world. It's truly remarkable how we have something this incredible here in the United States, and it seems to be something that is now pigeonholed only in the domain of those who study it professionally.
Well, yeah, and what really blows me away is, all right, for over, I'm just looking at basically the 1800s at this particular point in time, because the 1800s seemed, early 1900s, but basically the 1800s seems to be when so many of these graves, these mounds, were stumbled upon. And it's horrifying to think that we thought nothing of disturbing graveyards by plowing them under and building bridges and taking the stones and using them for gravel for all sorts of things. I mean, what happened? What is wrong with our culture that we don't have the respect for the? I mean, if somebody decided to plow graveyards under today, everybody would be up in arms, and there would be all sorts of, legal things going on, and oh, for God, don't disturb our dead. But we thought nothing of destroying thousands of years of history to build a road.
Well, that's something that actually persisted for a very long time. I recently did a presentation at the Serpent Mound in Ohio on the tall ones, and there was a retired archaeologist who had participated in his first excavation when he was 10 years old, who came up to me after my presentation concluded, and he told me, and my team, my people were all there, he shared a story with us about how in the 1960s he was involved in an excavation of an Edina burial mound in Ohio, and the lead archaeologists on the dig actually found the remains of one of these very large skeletons in the mound. And I asked him, I said, well, what do they do with the bones? And he said, well, he threw them in the trash.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the historical societies, all the way up until around the 70s or 80s, as long as they could get by with it, they were very disrespectful with the materials that came from these burials. We've seen incidents of artifacts that were stolen right out of the mounds and disappeared on the black market. And that's happening 1960s, 1970s. So the attitude towards the graves of the ancients really had persisted for a very long time.
Well, we're teaching our children to disrespect things like this, which is horrifying for me. You know, a lot of the history books, especially with the tribes that are out in the West, you know, they put their dead on platforms and they let them be. They sent them back to the Great Spirit or whatever, so that you didn't have a lot of burial stuff, but these are just, I mean, when you think it goes back 4,000 years, you're talking, you know, Giza Plateau stuff. You're talking way back in time, and
yes,
and these were a people that were, you know, we talk about our pioneers who were carving into the unknown and stuff like this. Well, hell, they weren't carving into the unknown. They were walking across the graves of those that had come before, and with no respect for them.
Well, you're absolutely right. The cultural legacy is really amazing because just with the first book, the oldest instance of the discovery of gigantic skeletons that is mentioned in the book comes from a site in the St. Lawrence Seaway that dates to around 3,500 BC, and this is closely followed by several sites of the old copper culture in Wisconsin, Michigan, southern Ontario, and those sites date to around 3000 BC. And what a lot of people may not realize is how advanced ancient people in North America actually were. For example, there have been copper tools found, very advanced copper tools for hunting and fishing that have been found in North America, dated back as far as 5,700 or 6,000 BC. And that's 3,000 years earlier than most other people around the world were fabricating copper tools for practical use. So even from a technological standpoint, the cultural heritage here is quite remarkable.
Well, and I think that we do our children a disservice by not talking about things like the copper mines up in Michigan and Minnesota, which I think they have, I don't know why, but 9,000 years comes into mind. So I think it is something they've been in production for at least 9,000 years. Now, in order to be mining, you have to have a lot greater intellect than a lot of other things. You have to be able to spot the rocks that have the copper in them. You have to be able to realize that you can hammer it out. That you can. I mean, the copper from those mines was, I think, 99% pure, or some of it was anyhow, and it boggles my mind to think that we have this rich culture here in the United States that for whatever the reasons we are teaching our children to ignore, and we're not giving them the respect, the people that literally were the beginnings of our DNA. I mean, that's where we come from. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was. You know, we didn't all, you know, come over on a ship and, you know, come over on the Mayflower, and you know, there is no such thing, I do not believe today, as a pure bloodline of any kind.
we are all sort of the product of many lineages. That's very true. And, the fact is, you mentioned the copper mining. I would also add to that. You're talking about, the organization and the skill that it takes just for that practice. As we found in our research, several people have conducted independent scientific examinations of the copper artifacts in the Great Lakes region and found that some of these artifacts were manufactured by melting and casting. And that goes completely contrary to what you would learn in a university about the copper artifacts, because in the university circuit, we're taught that Native Americans never attained that level of technological advancement. But we know from several scientific examinations that indeed some of them did. So this is an issue that really comes down to, in the 1900s, the determination was made to define all ancient cultures in North America as barbaric. In fact, it goes back to the 1879 paper from the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian, which instructed field agents to interpret everything they found as barbaric. And so what happens is we have well over a century of academia that's built around this idea, and no one really feels like being the person that comes along and says, actually, that's not true. It's more the opposite.
Well, and what gets you is the artifacts that have been dug up that are still in the public venue, and there aren't that many of them, it appears. Okay, so we've got arrowheads out of stone that were flinted out of stone and stuff, but there are also spear points. There are also fish hooks. There are also those decorations they wore around their necks. There's also bracelets and all sorts of copper accoutrements that are buried with these people. And not only that, their burials, they didn't just shove people in pits. They created graveyards and grave sites. The mounds that you talk about in your area of the country there, they weren't just thrown like our cemeteries. You put them in a box and you shove them in the ground. But these people were buried. There was ceremony. There was a lot of them they were wrapped in birch bark. And they were laid in certain ways, whether they were sitting or whether they were whole or whether they were reburying a group of bones that had been buried someplace else. But there was a respect for their dead that in some ways I think it was greater than the way we lay people to rest. I mean, they had artifacts with them. They had things to take with them into the next world. I mean, there was so much more to a person's life then than there appears to be today.
That's a remarkable observation. I really appreciate that because as I studied during this research the Edina culture, the mound builders in the Ohio Valley between 1000 BC and 300 AD, I began to develop a deep appreciation for these people. I was studying what they ate, how they lived, the clothing they wore, their basketry, and identifying with them across the ages as human beings was a very important experience, because there's this idea today that these tall ones, these giants, are somehow either some sort of hybrid race or abomination, and it simply isn't true. These were certainly people, and you mentioned their respect for their dead. I'd like to point out that the prevailing theory is that many of those artifacts that they're buried with that you mentioned, those probably weren't personal possessions of the people buried. Those were possessions that the mourners and the families of the dead actually deposited in the tomb with them as a way of paying their respects. And just to elaborate further on what you said about how incredible these sites are, I would like to describe what I think is probably one of the greatest archaeological sites in North America.
Sure.
This is a burial mound, just to give the audience an idea of the types of things which have actually been found here. This is a burial mound from Northeastern Ohio. It's called the North Benton Mound. This mound was 75 feet in diameter and 7.5 feet high when it was excavated in 1939. And what they found was that the builders had completely stripped the ground surface and created a paved surface of sandstone as a floor. And within the earthen limits of the mound, just inside the earth of the mound, the excavators discovered a circular stone wall that basically encircled the entirety of the mound's inner features. This is a megalithic stone circular wall inside the mound. Now, just inside the megalithic stone circle within the mound was a post circle 70 feet in diameter. On the western side of the mound, the excavators found a corridor consisting of two parallel rows of posts that ran from an entryway to the central area of the mound. And in the east, directly opposite the corridor, they discovered a large eagle effigy made of stone that measured 32 feet between the wings and 16 feet from the tail to the head. And there were two burials, each placed in one of the wings of the eagle. In the southern wing, excavators found an extended male skeleton on a clay platform, and these remains were described in 1940 by the archaeologist as an abnormally large male, and in 1945 the same archaeologist referred to this skeleton as an extremely large male with massive bones. And the north wing burial was a female who was close to 6 feet tall, and at the feet of both of these skeletons in the wings of the eagle were found the fragments of crushed human skulls. In another section of the mound, there was a large megalithic tomb containing the remains of an older male still holding in its hands a copper panpipe. And there are numerous artifacts and features from this mound. I could talk about this single mound site all day, but that should give you an idea of just how incredible some of these archaeological sites really are. They hold their own with anything else in the ancient world.
Oh, absolutely. And you've got a chart of this particular site in your book, and it's profound to look at. I mean, none of us would be able to bury our dead with that much ceremony and with that much, it does take you back almost to ancient Egypt to a degree as far as the different aspects to what were there. And is this one of those that I think there were a couple that it almost there was a trench around the site as for water, so that in many ways it was kind of like the dead had to cross the water in order to get to the other side.
Well, that is a type of Edina mound that we see at sites like Marietta, Ohio, some of the Edina mounds in Chillicothe, and several of the mounds here in West Virginia. And what we're talking about is the burial mound would be built inside of what archaeologists call a sacred circle. And in the Edina culture, a sacred circle is basically a circular earth wall with an interior ditch. And it usually features one entryway. The entryway is like a causeway. Inside of these structures, the Edina people probably engaged in various ceremonies and ritual practices for an unknown length of time. And then on some occasions, they would construct a burial mound inside the circle. So that combination of the mound and circle is a recurring type of earthwork during that time period in the first millennium BC. And it's really quite interesting to read about the possible meanings of these earthworks. Several archaeologists have speculated that it could represent a cross-section of the axis mundi in the mound builder cosmology. And I've also seen some ethnographic papers that talk about the possibility that the trench and the ditch may have filled with water at different times to represent a water barrier, because in several Native American cosmologies, the dead do not pass over water, so it was sort of a barrier to retain the dead.
Now in some of these sites, there are different layers of burials, so that, a single mound could have burials of different time frames and ages. So that, and the other thing that I found fascinating was that in some of these mounds, it looked as though different communities were meeting to bury their dead or their respected dead in mounds, so that their dead, in many ways, united their communities as one.
Yes, that is the cosmology that held these cultures together for many thousands of years. When it comes to the burial mounds, the concept is that these people lived in dispersed hamlets throughout river valleys here in the Ohio Valley, and each dispersed hamlet consisted of several families who lived hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and in the earlier times, each smaller group had its own burial mound, and they would inter their dead in that mound throughout the years, and probably used that mound for several generations. But what happened after about 200 BC was these large ritual landscapes consisting of multiple burial mounds began to appear, such as the one here at Charleston, West Virginia, where I live. And at these sites, multiple communities would gather on a ritual basis to bury their dead together at these sites, probably because in burying their dead together, they were symbolically adopting a common ancestry and heritage. And it was this concept of the ancestors being united, of having a common ancestry, which really allowed these cultures to exist for so long and in so many different forms.
Well, and but the other thing I found interesting was that in one mound you could have people who were interred with their flesh, and then there would be just bundles of bones, and then there would be evidence of cremated people, so that they had different ways of putting their dead together, which was fascinating as well.
Yes, there are several possibilities which could account for those three major types of burial. In some instances, and it's important to remember that with these cultures, diversity is the key word, because the expression of this ritualism is very diverse and it varied between region. But in some instances, it may be that particular communities or lineages buried their dead in the local mound in a certain way. So those people may have bundled their dead, whereas another community may have cremated their dead to deposit them in the same mound. Another possibility, and the one that I actually favor, is the way the dead were deposited in the burial mound may have reflected the process that the community considered that person's spirit to be going through at that moment in time. For example, we know that some Native American communities believe in reincarnation, so it's possible that burying a body in a certain method or processing a body in a certain method may have represented whether or not that person was believed to be returning at some point.
That's fascinating. Well, I think several of the things that just blew me away. Certainly, when the further back you go, the more primitive the artifacts that you are able to pick up from these sites becomes. But the later you get, it was fascinating. Not only was there copper, but there were often crystals that were there. There were mica was put into some of them. I mean, the quality of their artwork was more greatly enhanced the further you got towards current time. But it was so impressive to me. And one thing that I sat and chuckled over, a lot of the artifacts, you said there were pipes, there were clay pipes and stuff like that. And I'm sitting here thinking, wait, there was no tobacco. What were they smoking in the pipes? Yes, you want to tell us what they were smoking?
Yes, they have recently found nicotine stains inside of an Edina pipe.
Really?
We know that they were smoking tobacco. It is entirely possible, in my opinion, that they were also smoking other substances. We know that the shamanistic or ritual practices of these cultures relied heavily on altered states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I have written a lengthy segment for my contribution to Chapter 6 in this book that discusses how Edina shamans basically transformed into animal-like beings in the minds of ritual participants. And we know that because we found their costumes in many of their tombs, where they would have masks made from the jaws or skulls of certain animals and other types of regalia made from exotic substances. But it is possible that hallucinogens or anything that could cause an altered state of consciousness could have been employed. But we also know that just the act of smoking tobacco could have been a sacred practice for ritual specialists also.
Yeah, but I would say it was not only probable, it was very possible they were using the hallucinogens, because most cultures found something that put them into an altered state where they could talk to the spirits and those who had gone before. I think that it's fascinating to look at what they treasured and what they felt were precious items to send people on to whatever their future was. Obviously, there was a spirituality here that was profound, because otherwise they wouldn't have valued, the body, once the spirit was gone, they wouldn't have been so careful with the body. They would have just ignored it and let the birds take their share. But they were reverent. There was a spirituality here in these mounds that probably is very profound, and I would suspect that in a lot of sites you probably have energy vortexes of some sort where someone has identified a source of power to put their people who had passed over on in order to help them transition to the next plane.
Well, the mound builders here in the Ohio Valley transformed the entire face of the landscape. There are very few places that were untouched by these people. The earthworks are very advanced. And regardless of what anyone says today, no one really understands the full purpose of these works. All we can do is look at them and speculate, but what's important to remember about that, and what's very encouraging, is that your interpretation of what all this means is just as valid as anyone else's. The establishment today is very good at sort of whacking people on the head for making suggestions about these sites when they themselves don't know anything about their purpose or intent.
Well, when you stop and think, okay, they were hunter gatherers. They lived with nature. They lived as a part of nature. And yet when you take a look at these mounds and the fact that a lot of the remains were laid on slabs of stone, that there was great care in the construction of these. And it didn't happen overnight, and they didn't have front loaders or anything like that. They were carrying this. They were doing this by hand with tools that were not easy to work with. And in order to create these mounds, it took a community to do it. It wasn't like you dig a hole and shove somebody in it.
Well, many times we find evidence that the dead were actually curated for an unknown length of time. For example, the Edina and Hopewell people are often found with what used to be called trophy skulls. In other words, we will find a burial, and with the burial, there's a stray skull in there. And the old interpretation was, well, these must have been war trophies. But recent research has shown that they're not war trophies. They are the skulls of people who may have died 100 years before the person who was buried with the skull and may have been an ancestor of that person.
Oh, wow.
So these practices are so persistent and timeless among these ancients. There are Edina sites on the East Coast, in Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, where they have found bones that appear to have been dug up somewhere else, transported to the site, and reburied. And to be quite honest, I can't help but wonder if those bones were not dug up here in the Ohio Valley and taken all the way to the East Coast to be reburied with migrating Edina people. There's a long tradition, not just in the ancient cultures, but in modern Native American tribes have been witnessed transporting the bones or the bodies of the dead to sacred sites for burial together. And it appears to be something that is tens of thousands of years old.
Well, it does seem, among other things, that while they weren't, I wouldn't call them nomadic people, but they were hunter-gatherers, and they probably did move around to a certain degree as far as weather and stuff like that goes. I mean, when you're talking Michigan, you're talking winters that were awful. I lived in Michigan for a while. I know what those winters are like. So, frankly, I would have become a snowbird of some sort, I think, if I had a choice there. But the one thing that has I have often thought that there were tribes of giants, and yet I know you call them a subculture, and yet I keep wondering, these people of very large stature, 7 feet, 8 feet, and above, are mixed in with all of the other bodies as well. It's not like have you found sites that are just the tall people? It seems to me that you have over 4,000 years that these people, these tall people, are mixed in with everybody else, which is confusing.
Thank you for pointing that out. First of all, what I'd like to say is that of the 4 major cultures that we're describing in this first book, the tall ones represent a segment of the overall population, and they are a segment of the population that is mixed with the rest of the population in no discernible manner whatsoever. So we may find a site where one of the large skeletons is buried in a mound with 50 other people, but the large skeleton has no artifacts, which means that giant, as many people would refer to it, that giant has no visible markers of authority or rank, whereas other people in the same mound do. However, we have other sites like the Cresap Mound here in Marshall County in West Virginia. The large skeleton that was excavated by Don Dragoo of the Carnegie Museum from the Cresap Mound was buried with numerous artifacts, including prestigious elements like beads, other things that would possibly represent some type of rank or social position. So they appear to have been among the population at large. They were biologically related to the communities which they were a part of, but they had no particular status that was always assigned to them on a consistent basis.
They seem to have the same I mean, because they were larger, their bones were denser. I mean, that just stands to reason. They got a lot. They have to have stronger bones in order to support larger bodies. Their skulls were the same. I mean, I am reminded about when the little kid in North Korea took over when his father died. And they had a picture of the army all lined up, paying him homage. You saw, you saw little person, and then suddenly there's this whoa, and then there's little person. It's almost as though, I mean, they're still out there today. I mean, we have basketball players that are 7-8 feet tall.
Well, my colleague Greg Little has done a fantastic job of debunking the popular explanation for this phenomenon in ancient times, that these people are just the basketball players of 2,000 years ago. He's published several articles on alternate perceptions website about this. But that being said, I think one of the reasons for the misconceptions on this subject are that people really don't realize what the reality is behind the myth. There's a lot of literature out there that talks about recurring finds of 10 and 13 feet tall skeletons from these old press reports, and what the actual excavation reports tell us that we referenced in our research is that the tall ones were usually people between 7 and 8 feet in height. And then there's a lesser number who were 8 feet and above, probably with 9 feet being the maximum. And so getting a real bearing on what this phenomenon actually is very important. Well,
is it a genetic anomaly? Is it an inherited thing? And the one thing too that that in whatever reason, well, in my knowledge, I wouldn't call it research, but when I'm fascinated on something, I do research. In the Bible, it talks about 6 digits on each hand and foot and a double row of teeth, and that's been pretty standard for a lot of the material that I've read. Even in the Bible, it mentions that. Of course, the Bible is not exactly a great reference book as far as history goes, but in a lot of the findings on that have been attributed to a giant skeleton or whatever, there are those double rows of teeth and those extra digits, and the other thing was fair skin and possibly red to blonde hair. I've met a couple of people that have those qualities and actually have the extra digits and the double rows of teeth, and I'm wondering, is that something you didn't mention it? I mean, it's mentioned briefly, but it's not mentioned as being a consistent. Is this something that you found or not?
Okay, well, in the context of what we're trying to do is I can only report on what I have seen archaeological verification for. Mm-hmm. And in those contexts, I can tell you that there is no instance of the extra digits in the North American, with the tall ones in North America. The double rows of teeth that many of the 1800s accounts reported, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, I believe that these people were exaggerating a phenomenon that we actually do see in the literature, where many of the Edina people and their ancestors from the late Archaic period had as many as 4 extra teeth. But I do not see any instance of a full double or even a triple row of teeth, as some of the newspaper articles mention. Mm-hmm. I've never seen an instance of that in any of the Edina skulls that we've studied or the skulls of their ancestors. But there is a recurring tendency of 1 to 4 supernumerary teeth in the lower and sometimes upper jaws of the skeletons. So maybe some of the people in the 1800s were perhaps exaggerating some of these finds.
Well, I would imagine you dig something up while you're plowing a field and you see something as large as these bones actually were. I mean, it's a very one of the common things that I have seen written over and over again was the skull was so large you could a full-size man could put the jawbone over his own head and it would rest on his shoulders. I mean, and that's big. And
well, the phenomenon of people placing those jawbones over their own faces, I think, has some basis in reality. We know that even as we cite in the book, there are numerous anthropologists who wrote about how massive the lower jawbones were of not only of the tall ones, but of all the people in some of these populations.
Well, I would think to survive in the kind of environment that they had to, that there was definitely a case of the survival of the fittest, and that would mean the strongest too.
Yes, the people from, just if we're looking at Kentucky, the Edina skeletons from the Mounds in Kentucky have repeatedly been described and found remarkable for their rugged and powerful build. We know that this was a very muscular and powerful population. In fact, I've seen mound reports from different parts of the Ohio Valley where many of the Edina females were also over 6 feet in height. At the McKees Rocks Mound in Pennsylvania, there were several female skeletons found that were between 6'2" and 7 feet in length. So this was definitely a prominent set of characteristics in the gene pool, these powerful builds.
Well, and when you stop to think about it, look at today. You know, if you are a tall person, you're looking for another tall person to be mated to, and so it would be a natural thing for the very large to, and I don't mean fat, I mean large, to seek a mate that was of equal standing, so to speak, so that they would probably DNA wise, their children would most likely have the same attributes. You're
absolutely right. That is absolutely right. And I'd also like to point out, in case anyone's wondering, this is not giantism. For one thing, these traits occur much too frequently, these unique physical types, to be accounted for with giantism. The bones were studied by physical anthropologists and mainstream archaeologists in the 20th century who commented on how remarkably robust and powerful the people were. The bones had marked eminences for muscular attachment, so these were very athletic people.
Now we have the mounds all over this country, but definitely in Ohio Basin and stuff like that. There is a plethora of them. Are there any other places in the world where there have been mound builders that have had similar types of construction to their graveyards?
On a superficial level, many of the earthworks here in the Ohio Valley are dramatically similar to the Western European burial mounds, including the concept of a conical burial mound that's surrounded by an earth wall and ditch, which is a phenomenon that we see in the Wessex culture in the British Isles from about 2100 BC down to 1500 BC. And early on in my own research, I used to consider that maybe these cultures and these people were the same people. There's so many similarities in the earthworks. Also, very large skeletons have also been found in the burial mounds in the British Isles and in Central Europe also. But when we look deeper into the material culture and settlement patterns and also the genetics of the different populations that built these structures, we see that they were actually completely different people who lived totally different lifestyles, but who seem, for whatever the reason, to have somehow had a very similar cosmology and view of the cosmos. So what the earthworks are really telling us is that ancient people around the world shared a common worldview of the structure of the cosmos, and that was reflected in burial monuments throughout the ages.
Well, what I found also fascinating was, the very oldest of the mounds don't seem to be astronomically located as far as rising sun and setting sun, but as you get closer and closer to ground zero 2,000 years ago, they do seem to take on a more cosmic understanding of the stars and astronomy, and Orion's belt comes in here over and over again with some of them as well, which I found fascinating, because we're talking no instruments. We're talking a culture where you really had to work very hard to survive, and yet they had a knowledge and understanding and connection to things that were, out in the cosmos, not just here on Earth.
That's correct. And the cosmology that we see when we look at the old artifacts and burial mounds, all we have left are the remains of tombs and grave objects, but even that is enough to show us how sophisticated the inhabited universe that they believed that they lived in really was. We're talking about a viewpoint that incorporated a multi-tiered cosmos of three major realms. It's easily comparable to Norse mythology or the Egyptian cosmos or anything else for that matter. It's truly extraordinary.
Well, yeah, and that's another part of the whole thing. They did have that concept of the three levels, and they did have the concept of the tree of life. And to me, history books tell us that the early indigenous people here were primitive, and I'm sorry, when you have that kind of a spiritual concept of an understanding of another dimension and then a lower dimension and then the here and the now, that takes you way out of primitive and puts you into a more spiritual, philosophical outlook on life.
It was completely philosophical, and we also, as evidence of what you're talking about, we know that during the period of roughly 300 BC all the way to 500 AD, which is when the majority of the earthworks that we're talking about today were built, this was a period of relative peace in the Ohio Valley. There's next to no evidence of warfare. There's little to no evidence of human sacrifice or any of that business. There is zero evidence of cannibalism. Some people think that all the tall ones were some type of race of cannibals. I can assure you that there is no evidence in the Ohio Valley that these people engaged in cannibalism as a cultural practice. So these people were largely peaceful, and their society actually seems to collapse around 450 AD because social roles were becoming institutionalized. So as their society became more like ours, for example, as their healers became part of a medical industry, as their agents of exchange became economic advisors, as their hunters became generals, approximately 1/3 of the people just decided to completely walk out on the whole show.
Wow. So, you get to that point when, and let me go even back further in history, where you had the society, the group of people. Early on, I think one of the most primitive time frames, way back 3,000 years or so BC, where the element of being in control or being, the boss depended on what it was the group was going to do. If you were really good at construction, then you became the boss of everybody while you were constructing something. But if it was a matter of hunting, then somebody else became the boss. And so the power was shared by everyone, depending upon what their abilities were.
You're correct. And that's something that we found very remarkable about Edina societies. There are a lot of researchers today who have completely rejected the concept that these people had chiefs or lineages of chiefs or elite rulers. And I happen to agree with them, because when I look at the burial patterns in the mounds and I see the placement of artifacts with certain people, what we're seeing is a heterarchy. And in a heterarchical society, it's precisely as you said. You may have someone who's the leader of the hunt, and that's a very important role, because we know how important that hunt was for these people. Well, that hunt leader would exercise authority during the seasonal hunts, but once they got back to the village, this individual did not continue to wield some type of power over the rest of the people. The same was true of the healer. The healer became active and asserted their skills and authority when they were needed. But as soon as a sickness was taken care of, then the healer did not continue to exert authority over the rest of the people. And what happens as the woodland period progresses is that gradually these roles are broken up and institutionalized, and they become prestigious. We see prestigious artifacts made of copper and different exotic materials which represent those roles, so we know that the people who were now engaged in these roles were seen as a type of elite. And it is at precisely that moment that their culture completely disappears.
It's a little scary. Maybe we should take notes on that.
Well, this is the spirit of the land, and I know this may sound strange to people, but the fact that this was a process that happened with the ancients who lived exactly where we're living right now should serve as a warning to us today.
Oh, I totally agree. I just, it, and what is it? Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it.
Precisely.
I mean, we certainly may be on one of those collision courses here that it seems really important for us to pay attention to, because I have to admit you've destroyed my belief in the tribes of giants, which is very sad, but very appropriate. I mean, I don't want to go out there preaching, I can still say there were giants in the land, and to be honest with you, from very early on right through current time frames, there are still giants in the land. And
there are.
So it's you haven't totally destroyed it, but I kind of, when they talk about the Bible and the Canaanites and everything, you think, holy mackerel, was there really a whole culture of them? And the reality is there wasn't a culture of them. They were a part of whatever culture they existed in.
That's correct. They were a part of the Native American gene pool, and that's something that we intend to prove with the newest phase of our work. That's what we're focused on, and we're going to show people who their living descendants are. And a very important aspect of this is, I feel as if it has fallen to us to sort of liberate these people from some of the mythologies that have been associated with them. But the really amazing thing is that the mystery, folks, the mystery is not only real, it's bigger than you thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about not a specific tribe or race of giants. We are talking about the tall ones as a persistent, timeless aspect of the Native Americans' own history. And you can find them from the West Coast to the East Coast, from Canada all the way to Mexico.
Okay, so maybe I can do that instead of my tribes of giants. It's probably a lot more authentic, and it probably will go a lot further as far as being able to prove it, because the aspect, again, it's another one of these things that is so important for I have grandchildren, and I hate the thought that my grandchildren are being taught in school that, they were the Native Americans that rode horses and shot bows and arrows, and that's not who the history is. I mean, that's part of it, certainly, but some of these burials, I mean, they had strings of beads, they had hammered copper jewelry, and not everybody walked around with dangle bracelets and everything, but they were pieces of honor that showed a richness and intelligence that went far beyond what we give them credit for. Far beyond. I think that,
I could probably help you with this by saying that I have actually studied cultures around the world. For example, I have 8 chapters ready for a book on Indo-Europeans that we're planning on putting out at some point. And something I would like to say on your behalf and to the audience, the Edina and Hopewell cultures and their predecessors in the Old Copper cultures of the Great Lakes, their culture was, if we're going to look at the material culture, the things that you just mentioned, like the exotic artifacts and the copper artifacts, their culture was more sophisticated and vibrant than the Copper Age cultures of Europe.
That makes me feel good.
That should really open people's eyes to the rich history of North America. I consider North America at this point to be the greatest mystery of ancient times.
I totally, absolutely agree with you, because when ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Egypt, okay, but North America was not an empty continent. It was full of rich, phenomenal cultures that we are not paying attention to. We are not teaching our children about, and it's a richness that is not only a love of the land and nature, and these people were one with nature. They didn't have smog. They didn't have internet. They didn't have, they had a purity of life, a oneness with nature that is something that we totally lack today, and we are absolutely, we have shortchanged ourselves as far as the connections with time that would give us a richer understanding of where us as a society we need to go in order to really get to a place where we have that balance between the spiritual and the physical and the metaphysical. We've lost that profound, and it's very obvious that they had it because of their reverence for those that had passed away and their ancestors and how they honored them. And they were doing just fine before the Europeans invaded and screwed it all up.
Well, you mentioned European invasions. I'd like to point out that the answer to this mystery of the Tall Ones and the disappearance of people like this from history, it may have something to do with how we live. And what I mean by that is we know that the Iron Age Europeans, Indo-Europeans during the Iron Age, there were still people of this type of build and genetic expression among our own ancestors all the way up to the Iron Age, because the Roman generals wrote about them in their field reports. There were Celtic people twice the size of some of the greatest Roman soldiers. But what happened is Rome, the type of civilization represented by Rome, if we want to call it a civilization, says that we have to build roads and parking lots and concrete temples on top of everything that's green. There's not a forest in the world that doesn't exist for us to chop it down, right? So it may be that this way of interacting with nature has some type of impact on our own DNA that we fail to understand. And it could be that the introduction of a European way of life to North America contributed to the downfall of these types of people existing in the Native American population, because we know from the accounts of the early explorers and early Europeans that there were still the tall ones among Native Americans well after European contact. We actually have found several rare diaries where they were witnessed building burial mounds and burying very large people in the mounds well into the 1700s.
Well, we have the Europeans to thank for smallpox, for the plague, and syphilis. I mean, among the very few things. They brought disease to this continent. Not that there probably wasn't something here, but it wasn't until the Europeans decided to discover us and colonize us that this kind of tragedy hit Indian tribes who had absolutely no immunity to some of the things that the Europeans brought over here. So, not that, I have ancestors that came over to colonize. So, I guess I'm partly to blame too. But when you get down to it, the element of earthing, are you familiar with that?
Not really.
They've got a book out on it that really speaks of it's important for us to walk barefoot on the soil to reconnect with the earth, because once you reconnect with the earth, physically your heartbeat matches that of the earth, and the early people that were here had that kind of connection, and they didn't have the kind of illness, and they didn't have the kind of anxieties that we do today, and sometimes we've lost touch because we live in buildings that have wooden floors, and we wear rubber-soled shoes, and we've lost the touch with the earth. And I don't want to be like Walden and say simplify, 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 but I do say that there is a reverence and a respect for the earth that we have lost, that would put us more in touch with our own spiritual nature, that would enhance our lives profoundly if we got back to it. But I won't go on that soapbox right now. One of the things I did want to get into was our culture here in the United States, and what happened in the early 1900s that changed a great deal as far as I'm talking about eugenics, and what happened with the bones and the artifacts of some of these people and why they disappeared, and what happened to our culture as a whole.
Well, there is a belief today that some of us who are awake are struggling against the implementation of something that people call the New World Order. But the unfortunate reality is that the New World Order has been here for well over 100 years. And it happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this really actually has a lot to do with what happened to the bones of the tall ones and why they're no longer acknowledged in academia, if you'd like to get into that.
Yeah, I would, because I think it's important people understand what happened.
Okay, well, first I should point out that what people refer to as the cover-up actually occurred around 100 years ago. From the 1800s up until the early 1900s, the Smithsonian and all the other institutions in the U.S. openly acknowledged and reported the discovery of the tall ones. They are in hundreds of papers and archaeological reports. So it was not a controversial issue until the policy of denial, which emerged from out of the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian, when a man named Elis Hrdlicka became the curator of the department in 1910. So Hrdlicka was an anthropologist from Czechoslovakia, and he had been at the Department of Anthropology since around 1903. And Hrdlička's Department of Anthropology was very concerned with what types of humans had inhabited North America in ancient times. And Hrdlička became the first giants denier. In his public interviews, he would disparage the existence of the tall ones. He also did so in many of his published reports on skeletal remains and anthropology. He always took the time to take a shot at people who believed that the Smithsonian had unearthed these remains. And so, under his guidance, the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian engaged in a full-blown denial of the existence of the skeletons unearthed by its own agents. And one of the things that's interesting about that is we found several reports which talk about the discovery of these large skeletons, and they were shipped directly to Hrdlička himself, so we know he was actually seeing some of these bones that were unearthed during his tenure. But the key to understanding Ales Hrdlička is in the fact that he was a prominent member of the American Eugenics Society. And for those who don't know, the American Eugenics Society was funded by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the Harriman families. It fought the eradication of the poor, minorities, and essentially all bloodlines in the United States not of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. A part of this program included the elimination of Native Americans, African Americans, Jews, Hispanics, and Caucasians who were of Southern Italian and East European heritage. Also, if your family had experienced more than one generation of poverty, you also became a target. So, the American Eugenics Society had targeted over 14 million Americans for elimination. And in order to sell their agenda to the public, they employed anthropologists from organizations like the Smithsonian and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And what they wanted from these people was for the anthropologists to organize the ancient humans from all over the world into a type of a racial hierarchy so that they could categorize different types of humans and then excuse themselves for eliminating those they thought were inferior. So American history at this point becomes quite barbaric. There were over 60,000 people sterilized in 27 U.S. states. Some medical institutions engaged in lethal neglect. The Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Lincoln, Illinois, gave patients milk from a herd of cattle infected with tuberculosis, for example, which increased mortality rates by 40%.
This is the United States now. I want everybody to understand. This is the United States in the 1800s. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's correct. By 1911, the Carnegie Institute, the American Breeders Association, and the United States Department of Agriculture had partnered together to outline plans to build lethal gas chambers in public to begin eliminating living people that they felt were unworthy of life. So, since they were using anthropology to justify these types of programs, it's possible that their agents in the Smithsonian, people like Ales Hrdlička, had decided to ignore or conceal evidence of an anthropologically superior people ancestral to Native Americans, because what a lot of people may not realize is that eugenics was merely the practical side of an older philosophy called Aryanism. And according to the philosophy of Aryanism, superior racial stocks had ancestors of gigantic stature, so they couldn't very well have ancient ancestors of the Indians reaching 7 and 9 feet in height, according to their own race religion. And we could get into Arianism. It's really fascinating. I hope that this is helping to clarify some of the things that happened.
Yeah, it is, definitely. I don't think people know about this, and I think there are going to be a whole bunch of people that are going to start fact-checking you, but keep going.
Good. Excellent. Fact-check me, because I can do this all day. We know that the mainstream educational system teaches us that eugenics was something that Francis Galton gave us, and we know that it developed into the scientific racialism that eventually spawned the Third Reich and the American Eugenics Society. But what a lot of people seem to be ignorant of, through no fault of their own really, is that eugenics is only the practical side of a type of religion that the elites in the late 1800s had embraced, called Arianism. So one of the primary architects of Arianism was a French anthropologist named Georges Vacher de Lapalge. And Lapalge was also a law student who, after becoming a magistrate and prosecutor, used the law to persecute people for religious expression. Lapalge used his time as the professor of anthropology at the University of Montpellier to articulate his concept of socialism, by which Francis Galton's eugenics could be implemented nationally in a fashion that would guarantee the re-emergence of the Aryan gene type from out of the gene pool of humanity. And his plan included the destruction of individual rights and the implementation of a compartmentalized society where everyone practiced a specific role or service and their reproductive rights were strictly controlled. So what's interesting about Lapalge is that his system of social change and genetic change was actually the inspiration for Huxley's Brave New World, the science fiction future dystopian novel.
Mm-hmm.
But we found that Lapalge himself was very preoccupied with ancient giants. In fact, all of the early Aryanists from the late 1800s wrote that their own ancestors were ancient giants. So this was a prevalent belief. And
okay.
In 1889 and 1890, while excavating a Bronze Age burial mound in Mediterranean France, Georges Vacher de Lapalge had discovered what probably to him represented scientific proof of his belief system, because it was here that Lapalge unearthed the bones of a gigantic skeleton that he measured at around 11 feet tall. And he published this discovery in Nature magazine, and it was actually peer-reviewed by several professors in the October 3rd, 1892 issue of the New York Times and the August 1890 issue of the Popular Science News. So Lapalge's quest for elements of his ancient Aryans went to new and disturbing lengths after this discovery. There's an incident where he lured a group of young girls back to his lab, and he wanted to measure their heads and chests to see how many of these ancient Aryan genes they had still inherited. So, to get to the point of one reason Lapalge is so important is that he was a close friend of Elis Hrdlicka, the American giants denier. And they both presented at the same eugenics conferences in the United States.
Oh, wow.
In 1921, Lapalge was the keynote speaker at the Second International Congress of Eugenics, held at the American Museum of Natural History. And at this conference, he stated, "I solemnly declare that it depends on America to save civilization and to produce a race of demigods." Other speakers at the same conference include Margaret Sanger, Elie Serlichka, and Madison Grant. So here we have one of the architects of scientific racialism, Lapalche, who claims to have discovered a giant of his own, whom he must have thought of as his own ancestor, who was close personal friends with North America's first giants denier, Elie Serlichka, and they both present at the same eugenics conferences inside the United States. And there's a long tradition of this phenomenon through the history of eugenics. For example, I mentioned Madison Grant as an associate of Lapalche and Serlichka. Madison Grant was probably the most influential American of the early 20th century. He was a prolific laborer for eugenics. He held membership in the American Eugenics Society, the Immigration Restriction League, the International Committee on Eugenics, and he was a co-founder of the Galton Society. When the French edition of his book, The Passing of the Great Race, was published, Georges Lapalche wrote the introduction. And what's interesting about Grant is his work was used to adapt Aryanism for an American audience. It was really Grant's work that convinced America to embrace eugenics.
Yeah, and I think what I want people to understand is this is not just a small little movement. This is a worldwide movement. This is huge. Yes,
it was huge. I think in our postscript we profile somewhere between 20 and 30 major politicians, ethnographers, and different types of prominent people who embraced and promoted this movement around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that they all held in common was a belief that the superior races had descended from these ancient giants from around the world. In fact, in The Passing of the Great Race, Madison Grant claimed the Biblical Amirites, which is one of the tribes of Nephilim giants from the Bible. He claimed the Biblical Amirites as ancient Aryans or Nordics. And from that point, we see that surface in the literature time and again, even in the writings of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was the eugenicist who influenced Hitler. And Chamberlain, his book, The Foundations of the Century, which was published in 1899, was considered the gospel of the Nazi movement. And here's a quote from that book, actually. He's writing about the biblical giants, and he states, "These our own kinsfolk are those children of Anak, the men of great stature, who inspired the Israelites with such terror. To them belong those Rephaim who carried gigantic spears and heavy mail of iron." So the movement spread everywhere and eventually inspired the Third Reich and the American Eugenics Society. And one of the central tenets was that inferior racial types could not have these types of physically superior, very tall human beings in their ancestry.
So a lot of the large bones that were found were not so much destroyed as bought up by people who felt that they had to protect their own ancestors.
There are several possible motives for why the bones became obfuscated at that time period that were probably all at work at the same time. There were eugenicists in the Smithsonian who probably considered the large remains found in North America to have been some colony of their own ancestors. And certainly we found papers written by Smithsonian curators who attributed the presence of the swastika in some of the ancient sites in North America to the presence of a colony of these lost Aryans, and we quoted those curators' papers in our book. So that's one possible motive. Another motive that was probably at work was simply the desire to continue to label the Native Americans as genetically inferior by concealing the fact that the bones of their ancestors were so remarkable and large. So again, it's the result of a number of motives, none of them pure, and all of them the result of the unholy relationship between archaeology and international eugenics, which dominated the 20th century.
Well, I think one of the other amazing connections that I sat back and chuckled over is that at some point they determined that there was also a link between some of the mound builders and their mounds and Freemasonry and the Templars.
Yes. We actually found reports from Masonic lodges and from the Smithsonian validating what you're saying. Although we may consider some of this to be absurd today, the important thing is what we're talking about in this interview are beliefs that very influential people held between the late 1800s and about 1950. So if this sounds disturbing to you, it should be an example of how disturbed the people who created the world we're living in today actually were.
Are,
yes. The secret societies, we found that every secret society, from the Theosophical Society to the Rosicrucians to the Freemasons, were all of them harboring a very unhealthy interest in these bones. And it seems that all of the occult organizations really wanted to include these mound builders into their own history somehow. In fact, a lot of people have asked me about Lovelock Cave. Well, one thing that our primary sources definitely confirmed about Lovelock Cave was that at least one body was found that was probably around 7 feet in stature. It was mummified and still had flesh and muscles attached, and it was actually stolen by a local fraternal lodge that boiled it in a stew and used it in initiation ceremonies.
Now, Lovelock Cave, is that the red-haired giants that the Indians talked about?
Yes.
Okay. You want to explain, because people may not be familiar with that story, and you're probably better at it than I am.
I'm certainly not an expert at Lovelock Cave. I do know that the Paiute Indians have a historical legend about their ancestors having a conflict of sorts with people of remarkable stature who had been trapped in the cave and then either burned alive or annihilated in some other fashion by the Paiute.
Yeah, I think the story was they chased them all into the cave, and they set fires at the mouth of the cave so that everyone inside was killed. And then
that's correct.
And then a century or so later, guano hunters discovered the guano that was in the. This is how I understand it. That they went to mine the guano, and in mining the guano, they found the large bones, the mummies, and the spears and arrowheads and things like that to the Indians proved their legend. And, they said, see, we told you.
Yes, and we should listen to the Indians more. There's no question about that. We should never have disregarded what the Indians had to say, in my opinion, about these affairs. And, that's a totally different culture than what we're dealing with here in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. The Lovelock Cave, that culture is a totally different culture from a different region, and it's really a remarkable example of how widespread these tall, powerfully built people were in the Native American gene pool.
And there are what gets me is there are still people that will deny that they existed, but they so clearly existed, and they were from the very, very earliest of the Edina mounds and stuff like that. They're there. They've been a part of the foundational, of the, I won't say total foundation, because of course there were those that were here before even them. But as far as our records and carbon dating can put a time frame, they've been here since the beginning of what we can record, and they not only were there throughout the entire period, but they continue to still be a part of our population.
That's correct. They do. There are descendants of the tall ones that appear in a historical record up to the 20th century. And probably my favorite example of that is a man named Max Palmer. And Max Palmer was part Cherokee, and Max was born in 1927. In his adult life, he stood at least 7 feet 7 inches tall. His family claims he was 8 foot 2 inches tall. He had a natural athletic build. He did not have gigantism. And he was a professional wrestler for a number of years and an actor. And an interesting thing about Max is in 1963 he became a preacher, and he began calling himself Goliath for Christ. And he remained a preacher until he died in 1984. So I like to look at the story of Max Palmer because it really debunks the idea that this is the biblical Nephilim or something of that nature. But Max, being part Cherokee, connects him to the Iroquois and the Susquehanna, and these are all First Nations people who the early explorers recorded as having giants among them.
Well, and the fascinating thing is, along with of course the DNA that creates a person of this stature, in that DNA also creates there is a spiritual linkage to a heritage that may even go beyond that. And I'm not saying that they are aliens or anything like that. I feel that it's very obvious that these are people who were indigenous to the land that they lived on, and they were a part of the community that they were buried with. They weren't in any way, shape, or form people who were aliens. They were a part of our society. And so many people think, giants, okay, so, and as you said before, cannibals, or they eat their children and all of this. That's not true. They were a part of the society and accepted as part of the society. They were, in so many places when somebody is different, they are excluded, they are shoved out, they are not accepted. But these were a part of the communities in which they lived and died.
Well, remember, too, the First Nations, the Iroquois Confederacy of the Northeast, after the American War for Independence, the founding generation consulted them when they drafted the Constitution of these United States, because the Iroquois Confederacy was really the first successful republic in American history. Mm-hmm. So one thing that definitely means is that our own nation really is part of the legacy of the Tall Ones. Yeah,
good luck on finding somebody that'll agree with that. But no, I agree with you. But it just, to me, when I take a look at the richness that goes in to the history that you have followed back 4,000 years. I mean, it's outrageous the richness that we are depriving our children of because they aren't learning about it, and they should be.
Well, this culture, just just to touch on the point, a couple points actually that you made earlier in this interview with how wonderful these cultures are, and also with the eugenics. I'd like to point out that one of the architects of eugenics was a man named Arthur de Gobineau, who was a French aristocrat. De Gobineau wrote a book in the 1850s, long time ago, in the 1850s, called The Inequality of Human Races. And this book is the foundational gospel of the eugenics movement. And in that book, he described the mound builder cultures in North America and attempted to claim these people as his Aryan ancestors. So at one time, these cultures were not only regarded as a type of a civilization, but they were the desire of the world. There were people all over the world who knew about them, who heard about them, and who wanted to sort of co-opt them into their own heritage.
Amazing. And these wealthy people that tried to create this did create the one world order or whatever, are still out there. Are still, this belief in a superior genetic code and everything is still out there. It hasn't gone anywhere.
No, it hasn't.
It's still at work within our reality, and it's something that we should be very careful of.
Well, our world today in the West is the legacy of the American Eugenics Society. All the corporations we work for, the biological assault that's in our food, our water, and our air, the nightmare that is the American medical industry, all of this comes down to us from the eugenicists. And it is all a result of their influence on our national destiny. It should all be rejected outright. The unfortunate thing about today, about the 21st century, is people have forgotten how to say no. We've become too agreeable. We must remember how to become disagreeable. We must learn the power of no once again.
Well, there is a sense of apathy. There is a sense of this is what the history book says, and so this is what I believe, instead of looking into it. And I think that's what bothers me the most, that people our children aren't taught to think. They are lectured to, they accept things and they move on, or they Google something. They don't think. They aren't problem solvers. If you took some of our kids today and put them in the kind of environment that these early cultures developed in, they would fail miserably within the first generation. Unfortunately.
As much as I've studied them, I would probably fail myself. It's
well, no, I agree with you.
Yeah,
even though my sister studies shamanism, and she does walks with people, and she takes them out for lunch, and what she does is she walks them around the neighborhood and she shows them what they can eat. I'd probably die in the first 5 minutes. But they knew the healing qualities of things. Well, actually, the stuff I've seen her eat, I wouldn't want to put in my mouth, and yet it was probably healthier for her than whatever I did eat for lunch. But the aspect that in nature, if something is poisonous, a plant that grows very closely to it is actually the cure for what the poison is. Nature is amazing, but we don't teach our kids this anymore.
Nature is a living organism. And I think that if we were to look at the actual science independently without someone telling us what it's okay for us to think about it, I think that would grow more and more apparent. That underlying nature, you can observe this in the roots of the trees, for example, in a forest. It's all interconnected, and it actually communicates on a certain level. So,
Well, when you even look at some of their spiritual stuff, they really felt that they did believe in underworld, and they believed in a dimension above and the earth plane, and a lot of times shamans would look for huge old trees that had huge root systems, and it is through those root systems that they entered the realms below. It wasn't actually hell, but they went to the underground, to the to the underworld. And I mean there's so much richness and wisdom that's out there in nature that these early societies lived in harmony with, that is to be envied. When you look at what we live with today and what we ignore today and what we destroy today, the rainforests are going. I mean, we're destroying the harmony that is around us, that we could blend with and become one with, and have a much richer life. But with GMOs and all of the alteration they're doing to our food, doesn't even nourish us anymore. So it's scary.
One of the biggest differences between our culture today and the cultures that I've written about comes down to what represents your world, and what is it exactly that you consider a rite of passage for your children. There are some anthropologists who believe that the reason that we see exotics in the Edina and Hopewell tombs, like shell from the Gulf Coast, or a specific type of stone or flint or chert object that maybe came from somewhere far away from where the mound was built, perhaps several states away today geographically, is that the people at the time considered questing and traveling to other lands or other areas to be an essential rite of passage, and surviving those types of adventures to be an essential part of growing to be an adult. Whereas today we consider sheltering ourselves to be essential to growing into being an adult. The ancients here in North America, if someone was born in Kentucky 2,000 years ago, traveling to the Great Lakes may have been seen as a rite of passage, perhaps even a journey into another world. We simply don't know. But traveling to other areas and acquiring objects local to those areas was a really big part of what it meant to grow into the society that you were born into.
Well, and you did mention that especially in the Edina culture, it was a time most people, there wasn't a whole bunch of warring going on, though I imagine at times there were, but this was a time frame where people weren't afraid of other people. They learned to integrate, they learned to communicate, and they learned to share. And
you're right.
And that's something that unfortunately is not a part of our reality today. And I'd like to say it's different, but I don't feel it is. Before we go any further, I do want to first acknowledge your wife, Sarah, who was a large part of this book and did a heck of a lot of work on everything. I haven't given her enough of an act for photographs. She obviously did with helping with the research here. She's a silent partner today, but I do appreciate so much the effort that she put into helping you put all this together, because she obviously added a great deal to the book, and I'm sure that I know for sure she has to support what you're doing, and it's obvious that her influence is in many different places. Excuse me if I say it, your voice changes in some places that it's obvious that she's written. So I do want to acknowledge her work and give her credit for it, because along with you, that this is a masterful piece of material. And if anybody wants to, is there a website? You didn't give me a website. So is there some way people can find out more about you and your work?
Absolutely. We have a website. It's called paradigmcollision.com, and you can read basically almost all of our published articles on that website. We've published many articles over the years on different subjects, including the tall ones. And you can also reach both of us on Facebook. So if you happen to be on Facebook and you want to reach out, we're available. We like to keep a close connection to our readership so that we can answer questions and learn together with the people that read our stuff. So,
well, I know that when Patrick and I did the Secrets of the Stones, we got contact from people all over the country, and this mode, the internet, is an amazingly wonderful tool for reaching out all over the world and gathering people who are like-minded and are focused on the same types of things as we are. And this interview will be on my website by tomorrow, and it'll be up on YouTube by tomorrow. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to get this information in there because it's so important that both of you know how greatly appreciative people are of the work that you've done, because when you put something like this in print, when you put it out there, it always seems to find where it belongs. It always seems to fall into the hands of the people that are looking for the information. And of course, it's like that Clairol commercial from way back in the 50s, and they told two people, and so on and so on and so on. The internet is a great way of getting the seeds of wisdom out there that will, fall on the right soil and will, spread, and the information will be shared. So I can't thank you enough for doing all of your work, and Sarah as well. And I apologize for not including her on the interview, but until I got the book, I didn't realize that Sarah had been as large a part of this effort as you were.
Well, she is. It just so happens that I'm the one that does most of the interviews. It's probably because I talk so much, and so it usually falls to me to do the interviews. Some may say I talk too much. Who knows?
Well, I will admit to you that I had a husband that did that too. I had to wait for him to take a breath before I could get a word in edgewise, but her touch is apparent in the book, and I hope you let her know that it's obvious that she was a great part of this, and that I'm sure that though silent, she was a very big part of everything that went on, and the research, and you couldn't do as much as you do without her support, let's face it. So there is that there too, and I don't mean financial, I mean emotional and intellectual. So, but I have to tell you that I am, I kind of want to go out and look for a mound now. I mean, I'm in Connecticut, and I don't believe that. I know there are some here, or were some here. I know there were some bones discovered here over the last 150, 60 years or so. But where is the preponderance of them? You're mostly, looking at Virginia and the Ohio basin and stuff like that. Did you guys get up to Monk's Mound? Have you ever looked into that particular mound?
Monk's Mound is going to be in our second book, because we're working with identifying the people whose ancestors built the mound.
Mm-hmm.
The mounds in this first book, the Edina and Hopewell mounds, the largest concentration is in the Ohio Valley in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. But there were manifestations of Edina and Hopewell all the way to the East Coast and down to the Gulf. And some of those cultures will also be described in our future work. In Connecticut, I believe the Edina sites in Connecticut are usually non-mounded. On the East Coast and in some regions, the Edina, for whatever the reason, did not construct mounds. Many of their sites are large ossuaries which contain multiple individuals.
Mhm.
But they have been found, and I think that probably if we were able to see all of the evidence at one time, we'd probably see that these cultures covered most of the United States east of the Mississippi River all the way to the Atlantic coast. So they're very widespread, although they did not always construct mounds. The Edina sites in Maryland and Delaware, for instance, they do not have mounds. They're just subsurface pits, but they are the same culture and people.
Wow. Well, I know that the stone chambers and stone walls here in the Northeast, while there are some of them in other parts of the country, this is where most of them have survived, and probably because it was some of the areas that they're in were the rockiest to be developed, so people didn't destroy them as rapidly. They're still being destroyed, and I'm wondering if the mounds were the same way, as if in some cases I noticed that farmers would plow around the mounds, that it wasn't until they were actually dug into that they discovered that there was something there. But it's almost as though farmers they plowed around the mounds and planted around the mounds as opposed to trying to level them for a long time, so that there was a respect that you didn't know why it was there, but the mound was preserved for a certain amount of time because they just weren't going to destroy it. So, but the photographs that you've got in the book are profoundly beautiful, and somebody put a lot of work into this.
This book is the first large publication that we've done from a research project that is now in its, I think it's 8.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
There are actually photographs of stone mounds, or what's left of them, here in West Virginia. In the book, the Edina mound builders actually had a prolific megalithic tendency. They constructed numerous stoneworks, sometimes serpent effigies, stone circles, stone mounds, some of which had passageways that led to the inside of the mound.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that, well, it's as the archaeologist William S. Webb said in the 1950s, most of these sites had been destroyed by the time they realized how prevalent stone construction was as an aspect of the Edina culture. So we have an entire chapter where we tried to recreate sort of the different types of stone structures that the Edina built, many of which contain large skeletons also.
Yeah, I just, it's been a thrilling experience to go through your book with you, because an education for sure, and certainly it is enlightening, and it does make you wonder more about these people and understand that they were not primitive. They lived in a simpler time, but that doesn't mean their intellect was primitive, and so many people tend to believe that they were, they didn't have minds and they weren't thinking and they weren't reasoning, because these were people that had the same kind of brain capacity that we do, and I cannot believe that they weren't thinking and wondering and searching the same way we are today. And the way they built the mounds, the way they honored their dead, the spiritual feeling that I would imagine you feel when you're around these mounds and these structures, there's something there that has certainly traveled through time and is still impacting those who take the time to pay attention to what time has left them.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, these are not barbarians. They are not monsters. And they were an incredibly sophisticated people. While I was researching the lifeways of these cultures in the Ohio Valley, I formed a real attachment to them because it was so easy to identify with them as people. And to see that although they lived very different lifestyle than we do today. It's easy to see the human experience in the relics that they left behind.
And that they, they had families, and I'm pretty sure they laughed and they played, because the children were honored as well as the adults, so that they were, children were definitely a part of, a precious part of their community as well. And when a child died, they were honored in the same manner that the adults were in the mounds.
Well, we've actually found several accounts from Ohio of, and I believe these are in the book also, of what may have been family tombs inside the mounds, where they'll find the body of a child, a female, and a male. And in some of those instances, there's at least one of the tall ones among the bodies in the tombs. So certainly, yes, family was as important to them as to us, perhaps even more important, honestly, because in many cases, the ties which united people by blood and family in the ancient world meant life or death for the entire community. So I'm sure there was certainly an emphasis on that aspect of human life.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think without, especially way back, where without a government or authority and things like that going on, they probably had a richer life than as we come forward, where there were jobs and there were positions and there were places of honor and places of not honor. So, but we're getting real close to the end here, and I want to thank you so very, very much for helping me out and putting this information out there. I so appreciate all of your work and Sarah's, and hope that I can get you back to talk about this some more in a couple of months or a year or so to keep reminding people of the magic that is our past and the richness that we have as far as a past, and it's something we should be passing on and learning more about, instead of just taking someone's word for it, digging into it ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show. I've really had a good time talking about it.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and you did destroy a few of my fantasies here, but you gave me a couple of more, so it's okay. We're even here. So thanks again, Jason, and thank you for sharing, and I will get this up on YouTube as fast as I can. So good night now, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Everybody, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Please pay attention to what Jason said. He is an amazing man, and his research is not to be ignored. He validates everything that he has said. You can check it out because I did. I checked him, and his material is phenomenal, and it does add a greater dimension and a greater richness to the history that we all share. And it's something that we should be passing on to our children and helping them understand how precious nature is, how precious our past is, and how much more there is than in the history books. And to go beyond the history books is to find a greater richness within ourselves and within our community, and understand also some of the mistakes that we have made along the way, and make sure we don't make them again. Because, as I said earlier, if you don't pay attention to the past, we're doomed to repeat it. And we may be on a crash course here with repeating some of the errors that we have made in the past. And it's a good thing to recognize them and very possibly correct them before disaster hits us. Good night, everybody, and thanks for being here.